In an age saturated with obligations and noise, Henry David Thoreau identified the problem before modernity fully arrived. Born in Concord, Massachusetts in 1817, he began, on July 4, 1845, a precise experiment beside Walden Pond. 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days devoted to discovering what a human being actually needs and what can be abandoned without loss. Thoreau was not merely a diarist. He was a revolutionary diagnostician of freedom who transformed luxury into a philosophical question and time into a moral resource. What counts as a need rather than a manufactured desire? How much life must be traded for needless possessions? What does genuine independence require of daily habits? How can attention be protected from social demands? Can a person design a life that honors conscience before conformity? What makes Thoreau unique is the union of ethics and habitat. He treated a cabin, a ledger, and a pond as instruments of inquiry, turning simplicity into a method for thinking clearly. This exploration will survey his central ideas: simple living, deliberate attention, nature as teacher, and the foundations of civil disobedience, carefully and completely. Welcome to Sleepy Philosopher, a place for understanding profound ideas at a comprehensible pace. If this approach resonates, consider subscribing and share in the comments where you are listening from. Thoreau's simple living stands as the keystone of his philosophy. By reducing artificial wants, he sought a freedom measured in attention, time, and moral clarity rather than in possessions or status. Formed during his Walden experiment near Concord and refined through rigorous observation, this principle confronts the industrial and commercial pressures of his century and today alike. Its stakes are high because it asserts that the quality of life depends less on wealth accumulation than on disciplined limits that protect conscience, perception, and purposeful action. Simple living in Thoreau's framework is the deliberate restriction of needs to what is essential for health, work, contemplation, and ethical responsibility. He distinguishes necessities, food, shelter, clothing, fuel, from the superfluities that quietly enslave by generating debt, dependency, and distraction. The theoretical core is self-reliance, arranging material conditions so that one's time is governed by chosen ends rather than imposed demands. This economy of life, as he calls it, is not austerity for its own sake. It is a practical metaphysics of attention, where simplifying external arrangements enables heightened perception of nature and intensified awareness of moral law. Simplicity therefore grounds both intellectual clarity and civic independence. Operationally, Thoreau treats life as a ledger, auditing expenditures of money, hours, and attention to reveal hidden costs. He constructs shelter cheaply, cultivates beans for subsistence and study, and keeps meticulous records that convert everyday choices into analyzable data. These practices interrupt status competition, dissolve unnecessary obligations, and reduce the labor required to maintain life, thereby opening uncommodified time for observation, writing, and principled action. The mechanism is cumulative. Each relinquished luxury removes a chain of dependencies, wages, purchases, maintenance, that would otherwise claim attention. The outcome is time sovereignty, a condition in which perception sharpens, duties become explicit, and choices are evaluated against the standard of what truly matters. Contemporarily, the same logic clarifies dilemmas shaped by consumer credit, subscription sprawl, and algorithmic distraction. A professional facing burnout can map weekly hours against the overhead required by lifestyle choices, then cut recurring non-essentials to regain evenings for family, study, or civic engagement. A household can replace some purchases with skill, repairing clothing, growing herbs on a balcony, joining a tool library, reducing costs and environmental impact while increasing competence. A student can prune digital notifications, scheduling focused blocks for reading outdoors, thereby exchanging scattered attention for sustained thinking. Such applications are not nostalgia. They are instruments for reasserting agency over time, money, and mind under contemporary conditions of pressure and speed. Grasped integratively, Thoreau's simplicity is the precondition for his later political and ethical claims. A person cannot practice civil disobedience credibly without the inner and material independence that simplicity builds. The same economy that protects attention also anchors environmental responsibility, since reduced consumption aligns human purposes with natural limits. Understanding simple living thus organizes his worldview into a coherent sequence. First secure time sovereignty and moral clarity, then observe nature with disciplined perception. Then act responsibly in society, with conscience prioritized over compliance. This foundation sets the trajectory for the concepts that follow. Natural observation, for Thoreau, functioned as a primary route to enlightenment about human life. He treated the living world as a readable text whose rhythms disclose essential truths about character, purpose, and limits. He developed this method through steady, meticulous journaling, where attention itself became an ethical practice, refining judgment as surely as it recorded facts. Rather than seeking escape, he engaged the nearest meadow, pond edge, and woodland as a disciplined classroom, convinced that nature's cycles mirror the hidden regularities of thought and conduct. The intellectual stake is clear. A trained eye on the world clarifies the self. The theoretical core of this practice joins empirical attention with intuition. Observation means sustained, discriminating notice of phenomena, seasonal change, animal movement, weather, soil moisture, while intuition names the pre-analytic grasp that a pattern is meaningful before its causal account is formulated. For Thoreau, enlightenment emerges when intuition guides what to notice and empirical rigor stabilizes that insight in repeatable description. This framework treats the natural world as relational rather than fragmentary. Each living thing participates in a broader field of dependence whose structure becomes legible through recurrence and contrast. Knowledge, then, is neither mere data nor private feeling. It is disciplined attunement confirmed across time. Operationally, the method proceeds through repeated circuits, fixed points of reference, and comparative entries that accumulate into pattern recognition. A walker returns to the same shoreline, notes ice thickness across dates, and correlates thawing with prevailing winds and sun exposure. A notebook preserves these particulars so that sequences, not isolated events, become the object of understanding. The same applies to first blooms, leaf out, insect emergence, and bird calls at dawn. Changes in timing, intensity, and distribution reveal interdependence among water, temperature, light, and life history. Such records train judgment to move from noticing to inference without haste, allowing causes to declare themselves through consistency. Contemporarily, this approach grounds both ecological awareness and practical ethics. City ecologists use long-term bloom and migration calendars to design green corridors that preserve pollinator pathways amid dense development. Teachers guide students to maintain schoolyard phenology logs, creating local baselines that illuminate climate shifts more concretely than abstract charts. Hospital planners integrate windowed courtyards and daily light tracking to align patient routines with circadian cues, improving recovery outcomes without additional medication. Software teams adopt seasonal work cadences, deep focus cycles during shorter days, field research sprints in spring, to synchronize cognitive demands with environmental affordances. In every case, observation precedes policy. The integrative implication is that attention to nature consolidates the virtues needed for Thoreau's wider philosophy. Simplicity gains content, conscience gains evidence, and freedom gains orientation. A person habituated to the seasons becomes less captive to fashion, because tempo and priority are learned from recurring forms rather than from social pressure. This same discipline of noticing underwrites responsible stewardship, since decisions answer to concrete places and histories, not abstractions. Understanding nature's cycles thus prepares the ground for moral independence and civic courage, themes that deepen as the philosophical arc turns from perception toward action. Thoreau's account of civil disobedience stands as a decisive ethical intervention. It elevates personal conscience above statutory command when the two conflict. He forged this view through a concrete act, refusing in 1846 to pay the poll tax that in his judgment implicated him in slavery and the Mexican-American War, an action that led to a night in the Concord jail and later to the 1849 essay first titled Resistance to Civil Government. The stakes are exacting. If law commands injustice, mere compliance corrodes character. Civil disobedience becomes a test of integrity within the ordinary mechanisms of political life. It asks whether obedience is ever an excuse for wrongdoing. At the theoretical level, civil disobedience is a deliberate, public, and nonviolent breach of a specific law or policy judged unjust, undertaken from conscience and accompanied by willingness to accept legal penalties. Thoreau rejects majoritarianism as a moral arbiter. The majority establishes power, not right. Therefore, right must answer to a higher law discerned by the individual moral agent. He distinguishes conscientious non-cooperation from revolution by its scope and means. The aim is not to overthrow government, but to withdraw personal complicity and expose injustice. The citizen's first duty, he argues, is negative, not to serve as an agent of injustice to another, even indirectly through taxes, offices, or silence. Law's legitimacy, therefore, depends on moral alignment, not mere enactment. Operationally, civil disobedience works by interrupting the routines through which injustice reproduces itself, tax remittances, clerical compliance, and the quiet cooperation of everyday roles. The refusal is specific and transparent, its nonviolence clarifying that the issue is justice, not force. Acceptance of arrest converts private conviction into public testimony. The jail cell, in Thoreau's phrasing, can be the place for the just in an unjust state because it shifts moral pressure onto authorities. Repetition and contagion matter. Localized acts invite imitation, widen scrutiny, and alter the cost structure of enforcement. Writing, lectures, and petitions amplify the act's meaning, connecting concrete refusal to general principle without dissolving accountability for the particular wrong resisted. In contemporary settings, the Thoreauvian model illuminates a range of disciplined non-cooperation. Technology employees may publicly decline assignments that build invasive surveillance systems, state clearly their moral rationale, and accept contractual consequences to authenticate the claim. City councils adopt sanctuary policies that refuse to deploy local resources for practices judged unjust, inviting judicial review rather than covert evasion. Health professionals resist directives that discriminate against patients, document refusals, and face administrative penalties to foreground the ethical breach. Climate advocates organize peaceful sit-ins at permitting offices, halt proceedings without property damage, and treat arrests as occasions for reasoned argument. In each case, the combination of transparency, nonviolence, and penalty acceptance transforms dissent into a civic education about justice. Integrated with Thoreau's earlier emphases on disciplined living and attentive observation, civil disobedience functions as ethical housekeeping at the civic scale. The same scrutiny applied to possessions and habits extends to one's political entanglements. It clarifies allegiance by pruning cooperation that sustains harm while preserving space for lawful reform when law aligns with right. The result is not social fragmentation, but a higher form of civic friendship, grounded in candor about justice. Subsequent ideas will deepen this architecture of freedom by examining speech, work, and community as further sites where conscience calibrates participation. Self-reliance stands at the core of Thoreau's ethical and practical philosophy, asserting that authentic living requires trust in one's own judgment, capacities, and conscience. He developed this commitment through deliberate experiments in simplified living and disciplined observation, treating material life as a proving ground for moral agency. The stakes are high. Dependence on shifting public opinion, bureaucratic routines, and market conveniences dissolves personal responsibility, whereas cultivated competence restores it. Self-reliance for Thoreau clarifies what is necessary, prunes manufactured needs, and stabilizes character under pressure, making freedom not a declaration but a practiced capacity. It is the groundwork for every other Thoreauvian insight. Theoretically, Thoreauvian self-reliance is not isolation or rugged bravado, but a disciplined confidence that fuses material sufficiency, intellectual independence, and moral accountability. Material sufficiency denotes the ability to meet basic needs with modest, resilient methods. Intellectual independence means reasoning from first-hand inquiry rather than deference to received opinion. Moral accountability requires acting from conscience even when it conflicts with prevailing norms. This tripartite structure converts freedom into a set of trainable capacities. Thoreau understood nature as the pedagogue of these capacities. Direct engagement with seasonal constraints and local resources corrects fantasy, sets limits, and educates desire. The result is a personality capable of standing alone, yet cooperating by choice rather than necessity. Operationally, self-reliance advances through iterative experiments that expose and then reduce avoidable dependencies. Thoreau's method begins with an honest audit of costs, not only money but time, attention, and moral compromise, followed by small, repeatable trials that replace outsourcing with skill. A weekly ledger tied to actual hours clarifies trade-offs. A seasonal plan aligns goals with external constraints, and short learning cycles convert uncertainty into competence. Consider the adoption of basic home energy monitoring to track usage, followed by micro-adjustments in cooking, heating, and lighting, or a community skills exchange where neighbors teach bicycle repair and sewing, transforming occasional breakdowns from crises into manageable routines. Contemporarily, Thoreau's principle addresses platform dependency, supply chain fragility, and attention capture. A small business that switches from proprietary, locked-in software to an open-source stack regains control of data and costs. An urban building that installs shared rooftop solar with transparent metering gains resilience during grid disruptions. A family that standardizes simple, whole food cooking reduces logistical stress and financial volatility relative to delivery-driven habits. In professional life, cultivating cross-functional skills, such as basic data analysis, equipment maintenance, and clear writing, reduces reliance on brittle hierarchies. These choices demonstrate how self-reliance converts uncertainty into agency, stabilizing life against external shocks. Integratively, self-reliance underwrites Thoreau's entire system. It sustains simple living by keeping needs proportionate to capacities. It deepens natural observation by freeing time and attention for disciplined looking, and it enables civil resistance by lowering the personal costs of principled refusal. The same habits, ledger honesty, small experiments, skill cultivation, produce moral steadiness and practical ingenuity. Embraced as a lifelong practice rather than a heroic moment, self-reliance becomes a quiet architecture for freedom, allowing individuals to cooperate generously without surrendering judgment and to resist coercion without collapsing into bitterness or dependency. Essentialism functions as Thoreau's decisive pathway to personal freedom because clarifying what is necessary dissolves many invisible chains that bind modern life. He developed this emphasis through a disciplined inquiry into the basic conditions of human flourishing, contrasting enduring needs with cultivated appetites that multiply obligations. By insisting that most luxuries complicate life without enlarging the soul's capacities, he reframed prosperity as the reduction of needless dependence. The stakes are high. If freedom is the power to direct one's days toward worthy ends, then mistaking comfort for necessity quietly transfers sovereignty from conscience to consumption. Essentialism restores deliberate authorship over one's existence. Philosophically, essentialism here is a normative discipline for distinguishing necessities from superfluities, grounded in Thoreau's analysis of life's economy. Necessities are those conditions without which human vitality, moral agency, and contemplative attention cannot be sustained. Superfluities are additions that, once acquired, demand maintenance, surveillance, and debt of time. He repeatedly returns to four basal domains: food, shelter, clothing, and fuel, not as ascetic dogma but as a schematic for discerning sufficiency. Cost, on this account, is measured not merely in currency but in traded life hours and compromised independence. Essentialism thus links negative freedom, freedom from coercive need, to positive freedom, freedom to pursue virtue, insight, and service, uniting simplicity with ethical capacity. Operationally, essentialism proceeds by systematic subtraction. Identify recurring expenses of money, time, and attention, calculate their maintenance burdens, and test whether they advance chosen ends. Thoreau's method privileges experiment, time-bounded trials, reversible constraints, and clear ledgers that reveal hidden rents on life. One practitioner might cancel a storage unit, inventory belongings room by room, and adopt a one-in, one-out rule to stabilize possessions. Another might standardize tools, reducing redundant devices and the cognitive load of updates, cords, and syncing. These reductions change leverage. With fewer fixed costs, employment can be chosen for meaning, not merely for meeting proliferating obligations, thus expanding room for conscience and craft. Contemporarily, this framework addresses burnout, financial precarity, and attention fragmentation. A mid-career nurse relocates to a smaller apartment, sells a second vehicle, and shifts to 4 longer shifts per week, reclaiming a full day for rest and community work. A small architecture studio prunes peripheral services, focusing on adaptive reuse projects, which lowers overhead and aligns practice with environmental commitments. An urban household replaces multiple entertainment subscriptions with a public media pass and local concerts, gaining social connection, and cutting passive screen time. A consultant institutes a strict no-meeting day and caps client load, accepting lower revenue in exchange for schedule sovereignty and higher quality output. Each case converts reduced need into enlarged freedom. Integratively, essentialism consolidates earlier themes. Self-reliance gains practical traction when needs are light. Civil disobedience becomes more feasible when livelihood is less entangled with institutional demands, and natural observation deepens when attention is unfractured by maintenance chores. The approach also anticipates ecological ethics by aligning well-being with lower throughput of resources, turning sufficiency into both moral and environmental advantage. Understanding this logic reframes progress as clarity rather than accumulation. It prepares the way for further inquiry into how disciplined limits, chosen rather than imposed, create the stable platform from which intellectual, ethical, and civic commitments can be pursued with steadiness. Thoreau's Dialectics of Solitude names a crucial engine of his philosophy. Solitude is not deprivation, but a deliberate condition that clarifies perception, stabilizes character, and ignites thought. Developed through his disciplined periods of seclusion during the Walden experiment, solitude functioned as laboratory and lens, permitting observation of inner motives alongside the textures of the natural world. The stakes are significant because an undirected mind is easily bent by fashion and crowd pressures, whereas a mind trained in solitude detects its own priorities and duties with unusual precision. Understanding this practice illuminates why his social critiques carry the weight of tested conviction. At the theoretical level, the dialectic describes a reciprocal movement between withdrawal and return. Inward retreat generates self-knowledge, outward engagement tests and refines it. Solitude, in Thoreau's terms, is the condition of self-communion in which the individual hears the quiet register of conscience and differentiates intrinsic values from inherited habit. Loneliness denotes deficit of connection. Solitude denotes sufficiency of attention. The structure is cyclical rather than escapist. Periods of intentional aloneness cultivate faculties of concentration, frugality of desire, and moral discrimination that subsequently guide participation in community. The person becomes less an echo of prevailing opinion and more a steady source of considered judgment. Operationally, solitude works by simplifying inputs and amplifying reflective processes until noise recedes and pattern emerges. Thoreau relied on quiet walking, sparse surroundings, and unhurried note-taking to slow thought to the tempo of careful noticing. Such conditions allow associative links to surface, contradictions to show, and nascent ideas to consolidate. In practice, a modest routine, closing the door, keeping a clear desk, leaving devices aside, and committing observations to a journal, creates a feedback loop. Focus begets insight, insight motivates further focus. Even physical tasks that are rhythmic and undemanding, such as splitting wood or mending tools, can support this mental clearing by occupying the hands while unburdening attention. In contemporary life saturated by perpetual contact, solitude becomes a scarce but catalytic resource. A public defender may reserve 30 headphone-free minutes before court to rehearse arguments inwardly and decide which cases demand principled pushback. A journalist on deadline might work in a library carrel, offline, to structure evidence without external chatter. A parent of young children could take a twilight walk, alone and device-free, to sort competing obligations against long-term family values. A graduate researcher might schedule a weekly off-grid morning to sketch problems on paper, until a governing question appears. These ordinary, repeatable practices produce clarity that generalized productivity hacks cannot. Integratively, solitude interlocks with Thoreau's simple living, self-reliance, and moral resistance. Simplicity reduces stimulus, solitude concentrates awareness, and the resulting inward coherence enables firm public action when conscience requires it. The dialectic ensures that retreat does not harden into isolation, because each return to society functions as a test of insight against reality. Properly understood, solitude is a governance practice for the self, an attention discipline that preserves independence of mind, preparing the ground for further inquiry into how individuals can participate in communities without surrendering judgment or purpose. Thoreau's conservation legacy represents an early, rigorous articulation of environmental ethics that links personal freedom to ecological restraint. Writing in the midst of 19th-century industrial expansion, he insisted that intact woods, ponds, and meadows were not amenities but conditions of flourishing human life. Through Walden, the field notebooks of Concord, the essay Walking, and the 1860 lecture, The Succession of Forest Trees, he argued that wildness and biodiversity possess intrinsic worth that exceeds market calculation. The intellectual stakes are clear. A society that degrades its ecological base undermines its own moral and practical possibilities. This legacy frames conservation as a disciplined form of attention and responsibility. At the theoretical level, Thoreau grounds conservation in three intertwined claims: nature's intrinsic value, the interdependence of living systems, and the necessity of limits. Wildness names the unengineered processes, succession, migration, seasonal cycles, by which landscapes renew themselves. Biodiversity identifies the variety of species and relationships required for resilience. Carrying capacity and watershed remind decision-makers that human projects must fit within biophysical boundaries rather than assume indefinite growth. In this framework, economic activity is legitimate only when subordinated to ecological health. Policy and personal conduct are judged by their effects on long-term system integrity. The result is a stewardship ethic oriented toward reciprocity rather than extraction. Operationally, Thoreau's model moves from disciplined observation to prudent management. Systematic phenological notes create baselines for detecting change. Careful surveying identifies wetlands, woodlots, and edges where small disturbances have outsized effects. Governance mechanisms translate insight into protection. Conservation easements, community forests with rotation schedules, and riparian buffers that reduce nutrient runoff and preserve habitat. On-the-ground practices follow ecological succession rather than fight it, allowing old fields to reforest, timing selective cuts to minimize breeding disruption, and restoring floodplains to absorb storms. The mechanism is iterative: observe, compare against baselines, adjust actions to maintain diversity, and measure outcomes over seasons and years. Modern relevance appears in concrete choices. Researchers have used Thoreau's Concord records to show that many plants now flower weeks earlier, demonstrating climate-driven shifts that inform regional planting and conservation calendars. Municipalities enact pesticide restrictions to protect pollinators and groundwater. Land trusts acquire headwater parcels to safeguard entire river systems. Coastal towns adopt living shorelines that combine salt marsh restoration with flood defense. Technology firms evaluate data center sites by watershed stress and biodiversity impact rather than electricity price alone. Public schools integrate local phenology tracking into science curricula, generating community datasets that guide urban tree species selection and heat mitigation strategies. Integrated with earlier themes, this legacy extends simple living and self-reliance into a civic land ethic. Disciplined restraint at the personal level scales into collective rules that keep ecosystems whole. It also deepens solitude's role, turning attentive time outdoors into actionable knowledge that reorients policy horizons from quarterly returns to generational stewardship. The payoff is conceptual coherence. Liberty depends on respecting ecological law, and meaning emerges from participation in nature's renewal rather than its consumption. Such understanding prepares the ground for institutional designs that align infrastructure, agriculture, and culture with the durable rhythms Thoreau learned to read. Thoreau's influence on social movements stands as one of the most consequential afterlives of any 19th century thinker because it translated private conscience into public power. His articulation of civil disobedience provided a portable ethic that moved from New England to South Africa and the American South, shaping campaigns where legality and morality collided. Leaders such as Mohandas K. Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. explicitly drew from his reasoning, not for literary flourish, but as strategic guidance for collective action that could remain principled while being effective. The stakes are immense. Whether individuals can lawfully challenge injustice without abandoning nonviolence or moral clarity. Understanding this legacy clarifies how ethical conviction becomes organized social change. Thoreau framed a rigorous hierarchy. Conscience outranks statute when the two conflict, and passive complicity in injustice is itself a moral failure. Civil disobedience in his usage denotes conscientious, public, nonviolent lawbreaking aimed at exposing unjust authority, combined with a willingness to accept legal penalties to demonstrate respect for law in general while rejecting particular unjust laws. The majority is not the arbiter of right, rather the test is fidelity to justice discerned by reasoned judgment. This framework does not license private caprice. It demands clarity about harm, explicit articulation of principles, and transparency of action. As earlier explorations of self-reliance established, integrity is the prerequisite. The political expression is principled non-cooperation that turns personal ethics into social leverage. The theory thereby links moral duty with civic responsibility. The operational mechanism that traveled into 20th century movements combines moral dramatization with strategic discipline. Gandhi read Thoreau's essay and in 1907 praised its incisive logic in Indian opinion. He then operationalized its core into satyagraha, selective non-cooperation, boycotts, and readiness to endure arrest to display the injustice of imperial law. King adapted the same logic through a four-step campaign design: fact-finding, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action, ensuring transgression was intentional, proportional, and communicative. The Salt March illustrated how breaking a specific law could reveal a system's illegitimacy. The Montgomery bus boycott showed how sustained, legally risky non-cooperation could shift institutional incentives while preserving nonviolent discipline. In both, acceptance of suffering functioned as a moral signal that reoriented public sympathy and pressured authorities. Contemporary movements continue to apply this repertoire where formal remedies prove inadequate. Climate school strikes convert the refusal of routine participation into a public claim about intergenerational justice, keeping actions nonviolent yet disruptive enough to command attention. Coordinated rideshare driver log-offs and delivery courier stoppages use non-cooperation to contest algorithmic working conditions while maintaining public safety. Consumer-led boycotts targeting companies bankrolling discriminatory statutes turn purchasing choices into distributed leverage that is lawful in general yet confrontational in effect. University fossil fuel divestment campaigns combine sit-ins with transparent declarations of principle and readiness to accept campus sanctions, converting administrative penalties into platforms for argument. Across these cases, Thoreau's architecture persists: articulate the injustice, act openly, accept consequences, and treat discipline as both message and method. The integrative lesson is that Thoreauvian conscience scales when anchored to the practices already examined. Simple living reduces dependence on unjust systems. Self-reliance furnishes the resilience to endure pressure. Attentive observation cultivates the judgment needed to distinguish principled refusal from mere defiance. Civil disobedience then becomes one element in a broader constructive program, building fairer institutions while withdrawing cooperation from harmful ones. Such integration prevents performative protest and sustains reform beyond a single campaign, demonstrating how inner independence can reliably generate public courage and, over time, institutional transformation. Thoreau's integrated philosophy forms a coherent architecture for living with clarity, courage, and restraint, binding simplicity, self-reliance, attentive natural study, and principled resistance into a single orientation toward freedom. Developed across his field notebooks, Walden experiment, and political essays, this synthesis translates personal ethics into daily practice and public stance. Its stakes are unabashedly high. The claim that a person can reorganize material life, perception, and civic participation so that conscience rather than convention dictates action. Such synthesis rejects compartmentalization. It insists that economic habits, perceptual habits, and moral habits cohere, or freedom remains compromised. This segment articulates that coherence as a workable design. At the level of theory, the synthesis can be described as an ethic of sufficiency ordered to moral independence. Sufficiency names the deliberate reduction of needs so that livelihood becomes lightweight and governable. Independence identifies the capacity to follow reasoned conscience even when institutions reward conformity. Natural observation provides the epistemic discipline. Precise attention to seasons, species, and processes trains judgment to prefer evidence over rumor and rhythm over frenzy. Civil disobedience supplies the juridical principle that unjust law lacks legitimacy, requiring limited, transparent non-cooperation. These strands interlock. Simplified economy funds time-rich inquiry. Disciplined inquiry refines conscience. Refined conscience guides selective resistance. Resistance, in turn, protects conditions for continued simple living and study. Operationally, Thoreau's blueprint functions through reinforcing practices. Audit, attune, and act. Audit means tracking time, money, and attention to expose dependencies and discretionary excess. Attune means recurrent contact with local nature to recalibrate pace and perception. Act means aligning choices with articulated principles even under cost. Concrete mechanisms include thresholds for consumption and commitments, routine solitary study outdoors, and written criteria for acceptable work and association. For example, a medical association formalizes a conflict of interest rule that rejects vendor-funded events. A software cooperative declines venture debt to avoid growth mandates that would erode member autonomy. A research lab pre-registers protocols and refuses grants with gag clauses, stating reasons publicly. Contemporary application appears wherever individuals and institutions confront pressure to optimize rather than to live well. A data scientist declines to build predictive policing models, publishing bias analyses and accepting contract loss. A neighborhood grocery cooperative converts to bulk-only staples, cutting packaging and stabilizing prices against supply shocks. An apartment complex creates a shared registry for seldom-used appliances to reduce redundant ownership and electronic waste. In civic life, shareholders file transparency resolutions and exit funds that finance extractive projects, pairing economic withdrawal with stated ethical grounds. In knowledge work, editorial boards adopt slow-review policies that favor methodological rigor over impact metrics, trading prestige velocity for intellectual integrity. The integrative payoff is a life system in which material sufficiency, ecological attentiveness, and civic courage mutually sustain one another, reducing vulnerability to manipulation while enlarging scope for principled action. Understanding the synthesis clarifies that Thoreau did not offer scattered maxims but a practicable sequence. Simplify to see to judge, judge to refuse, refuse to preserve the space to live simply and study further. This circular reinforcement creates durable independence without isolation, enabling communities of consent grounded in shared evidence and restraint. Such a framework remains usable wherever future generations face accelerating speed, concentrated power, and ecological stress. Thoreau's closing reflections function as a durable orientation for the perennial search for purpose and truth, asserting that a life is well lived when desire, conduct, and principle are brought into honest alignment. He developed this position through years of rigorous observation and moral testing that treated ordinary choices as philosophical experiments. In a world thick with incentives to measure worth by external success, he argued for an inward criterion. Integrity as the standard for freedom and simplicity as its method. This conclusion is not retreat but resolution, inviting a stable center from which action acquires clarity and courage. It is a final calibration of means to ends. The framework can be stated succinctly. Contentment arises from congruence between conscience and conduct under the tutelage of nature. Conscience supplies the moral law, simplicity supplies the method of execution, and attentive contact with the natural world supplies the scale by which claims are measured. Thoreau understands freedom as a condition of self-rule, moral independence sustained by an economy of life that distinguishes needs from vanities and refuses complicity with injustice. Nature serves not as ornament but as instructor. Regularity, limits, and cycles educate practical reason about proportion and sufficiency. The result is a philosophy that binds inner clarity to outer practice without remainder. Nothing essential is outsourced. Operationally, this synthesis proceeds through disciplined practices that keep aims and actions commensurate. Individuals articulate a short list of non-negotiable principles, then translate them into concrete thresholds of sufficiency, enough housing, enough income, enough reputation, so that growth beyond those bounds triggers scrutiny rather than applause. A periodic review compares current commitments to declared principles and prompts selective refusal of projects that erode moral independence. Attention is protected by setting firm boundaries around time, place, and tools, while regular engagement with nearby land and weather provides an external check on abstraction. The outcome is a repeatable cycle. Clarify, simplify, verify, and when necessary, disobey. Contemporary relevance appears where institutions adopt criteria that privilege integrity over expansion. A mid-sized manufacturer can institute a repairability and modularity standard for all equipment purchases, sacrificing short-term novelty for long-term autonomy and waste reduction. A city can pass dark sky lighting ordinances that reduce light pollution, lower energy use, and realign urban nights with natural rhythms. A university can require a first-year watershed practicum, embedding every student's learning within the limits and dependencies of a local ecology. A credit union can design loans that reward durable, repairable goods, shifting incentives away from disposability. Each example operationalizes moral independence and ecological membership in present conditions. Principle becomes policy. The integrative implication is straightforward. Thoreau's thought unifies self-reliance, conscientious resistance, and environmental care into a single practice of calibrated living. The reward is not ascetic deprivation, but a clarified sense of purpose that organizes work, citizenship, and consumption around durable goods, truthfulness, sufficiency, and responsibility to place. As earlier concepts showed, courage in refusal and patience in observation are mutually reinforcing. The same habits that free attention also fortify ethical judgment. This closing synthesis therefore functions as an open invitation. Continue the experiment, test principles against life, and let measured simplicity anchor freedom amid shifting circumstances. The relevance endures because the practice is portable.